Hey there fellow creators, Ben here from Snipit Studios, and whether you're buying a student grade paint or a professional paint, chances are your paint is coming in a tube, and sometimes those tubes are plastic and sometimes they're metal, and actually sometimes they're jars too. But what is the difference between all three of them, the advantages, the disadvantages, and why should any artist care about the difference between all three of them? For that and more, stick around. So what we know today as the traditional paint tube was actually invented as far back as the 1840s, and its invention actually revolutionized the way artists painted, not just in the studio, but out in their environment. From the Italian Renaissance onward, artists were looking at a way to take paint making from just doing batch and batch and batch and batch of color and then painting to actually having a more convenient pre-mixed paint that they can take with them on the go. This began in a similar way to what might expect out of an old-fashioned water bottle, which was just sort of a animal skin or bladder or stomach that was dried and repurposed to contain some sort of a liquid. In this case, artists used pig bladders to store the paint. And while that worked to some degree, all they would do is just seal it at one side, puncture it, squeeze some paint out, let it reseal, and after a while, it's like, well, you can only puncture it so many times before it's not sealable anymore. After that period of time, artists started repurposing glass syringes and putting paint in those. But also we ran into the same problem of not being able to reseal the top super well. They were using corks, didn't really work, you had to kind of scoop the paint out. You couldn't just squeeze the paint out the way you could with the bladder. But thanks to some great innovations, like I said earlier, in the 1840s, artists went from the bladders to the glass tubes to small tin tubes, would be probably about half the size of a standard 2-ounce today, and those were the first metal paint tubes for artists. They had a screw-on cap, metal tube, preserved the paint, was you could squeeze some out, put the cap back on, and it worked, and it's like, wow, this changed everything for painters. And you can kind of see that looking through art history from about the 1840s onward. You start to see more dynamic paintings because the artists weren't mixing the paint on the go. They were using paint either they had mixed previously or somebody else had. And again, this invention of the tube not only took artists out of their studio, but it also expanded their range of color options. A big problem in the early days was preservation. Certain pigments and colors and certain mixes wouldn't last as long because they would either grow mold or just dry out. But the tube prevented those things from happening, so artists could work with not only more colors, but in different techniques and with a lot longer of a working time, and really, again, transformed the way painting worked, just by the simple invention of the paint tube. But these days, paint tubes are either aluminum or they're plastic. Specifically aluminum over the old tin because aluminum doesn't rust, and it's a little bit easier to squeeze than the traditional tin does. Plastic, on the other hand, very modern because plastics have only been around up through maybe the very late 19th century and into the 20th century, so plastics are sort of the newcomer in terms of paint tubes. But the real question is, what's really the difference here? And is there a good or bad versus the plastic and the metal? Okay, so let's start with the metal paint tube. This is the base standard for pretty much all high-quality paints. There are some exceptions, and we'll get to those, but the metal paint tube is pretty much the base standard for high-end acrylics, oils, watercolor, gouache, you name it, it's probably going to be coming in an aluminum tube. Metal tubes are extremely durable and resistant to things like cuts and punctures, especially in the shipping process today. But also think about the artists using those pig bladders, just puncturing it and squeezing, and that's probably not going to happen with a metal tube unless you're really, really trying to do so. With metal tubes, you also have the advantage of buying a metal tube that's empty and filling it with your own mixtures of paint, whether that be paint you made yourself or just mixes of colors you want to have an easier access to. You could just buy an aluminum tube, fill it with stuff, and crimp the end, and ta-da, you've got a tube of your own paint. Now you will find that most plastic tubes are from lower end paints. I would say the one exception to this is the Liquitex Professional. They put their high quality paint in plastic tubes, which is actually kind of an outlier in the grand scheme of things. What makes plastic tubes a little bit more interesting is they're more resistant to squeeze pressure. You can squeeze the paint out, but you don't run into the problem that a metal tube has where you squeeze it and then that squeeze retains its shape in the metal. Plastic tubes will have a little bit of feedback, a little more give. You can get actually more paint out of the tube from using a plastic tube than you could with a metal tube. Also, I've noticed that in a plastic tube, the caps themselves are less likely to accrue tons of dried paint. I've actually had metal tubes essentially break on me because I've had so much dried paint in the cap itself. Well, the cap's plastic, the tube is metal, and for whatever reason, that little bit of seepage in there can actually ruin the threading a little bit and cause some problems in the long run. But plastic tubes, for whatever reason, don't have that problem as much. The one I would say downside to a plastic tube is that it's more limited to a water-based medium, so acrylics, watercolors, wash. Specifically because oils will cause some degradation in the tube itself, which is why you'll probably almost never see oils tubed in plastic tubes. But what about that third option I mentioned at the beginning, the paint jar? One good thing about jars is they eliminate the problem of things like squeeze, pressure, punctures, and leakage across the board. Like, you don't have the problem because it seals completely differently. But of course, because it's a jar, you're only buying these in large volumes. Golden's jars are 8 ounces. I have some Utrecht ones that are 16. Those are sort of the smallest sizes you can get a jar of paint in. Few more upsides though, there is a lot less paint wastage with a jar. You can get nearly every ounce of paint, or maybe a milliliter, I guess, if you're overseas. You can get every single square piece of this paint out of this jar if you really try hard enough. That's not so easy with a tube of plastic or metal varieties. Most of the time you're either cutting the end off and scooping it out, or cutting the end off and scooping it out differently, but with, squeeze pressure issues. It's not so hard to do that with a jar because you can just open it up, get all it out, thin it out. There's less wastage with a jar of paint. Also, traditionally, a jar of paint is going to be more economical. While yes, you might be paying more for the initial investment of the jar, a jar, because of the way it seals, the screw-on caps, they're going to last longer, they're not going to mold as fast as a tube would. So you're looking at something that's going to not only last you longer in terms of preservation of the color and the paint itself, but also in the fact that, well, you're buying more paint that's going to last you a long time, rather than buying a 2-ounce tube every 3 to 6 months, giving you just a rough average there. I can buy a jar and maybe it'll last me a year or two and not have to then buy that color again and again and again and again. However, at the same time, depending on the manufacturer and depending on what colors you're getting, not every color is going to come in a jar. I've actually noticed with a lot of Golden's colors, I can't even get them in the jar because they just don't make the jar in that color. The color is not in the jar size because I guess it's not popular enough to warrant putting it in a jar. But for artists, the real question then becomes, what is actually the best option? Metal is the most preferred among artists and paint manufacturers due to the fact that the tubes themselves tend to have a really long shelf life, and the paint inside them kind of keeps a sort of stable, consistency across the board. So you don't have to worry about the paint degrading a ton in a metal tube. Plastic, while convenient and I get the feeling probably cheaper in some ways, but just speculating there, is good, but it is limited to certain media. You're not going to find oil paints in plastic tubes. So if you want something that can hold up to squeeze pressure more than aluminum, you still might be getting aluminum regardless. While jars, technically, I would say probably are the best choice in a lot of ways, due to the long shelf time above the other ones, the preservation of the paint, the fact that you can get more paint out of a jar than you can out of a tube, just in terms of squeezing or whatever. The issue is always, can you get the color in a jar, and how much do you really need the color? I think it's a good economical choice if you use a lot of a certain color. That's why I have sort of like black, white, and I think a yellow as well in my jars, because I use those colors a lot more often than all of my others. but I can also get the tube, and the tube lasts just as long depending on what I'm using and things like that. But overall, really it's a preference. It's a preference for manufacturers, it's a preference for artists, and the difference between all three of them are pretty negligible across the board. So what I found the most interesting in researching this topic today is that, one, there's actually not a lot of research behind it. A lot of what I've gathered of this came out of like 2 different articles, and they're mishmashing a little bit. So there's not a lot here in terms of how much information, good, bad, whatever, exists out there for artists. I think one factor to look at and consider is recyclability and sustainability across the board for all of these. Looking into the future, it's interesting to think what vehicles might be holding our paint in the future. I do think there is some level of maybe looking at things like the metal and the plastic debate, or if there's a debate at all, I'm not really sure. But both of these, you're emptying the tube, you're throwing it in the trash. So there's a little bit of wastage happening with those. The jars you can recycle depending on where you are and what your local recycle company takes. But at the same time, again, you're looking at like, well, what do I do with the wastage of the paint tube itself? Now, there can be arguments for maybe pushing to a biodegradable container. This is a thing that a lot of food companies have done by things like a bag of chips that degrade in like a month, whatever. And while that's okay for something like maybe a bag of chips that people are going to buy and take off the shelf and eat within a week, tubes of paint need to last. They need to have a shelf life, and they need to not degrade with the paint inside of them. So there's a little bit of a dilemma here. It's like you can maybe make a paper tube that biodegrades, but also it won't hold up to the paint itself. The paint will seep through, the water will absorb. And eventually you will run into the problem of, unless you're using that tube of paint quickly, then a biodegradable container is a bad idea for paint, because you run into this issue of like, well, does it hold the paint? No, it doesn't hold the paint. It doesn't have the shelf life. It's not good for artists to work towards something that is in that way going to destroy their paint before they even get it onto the canvas. One thing I do think could be a possibility is finding a way to recycle the metal paint tube. Whether that be opening it up, letting it dry, turning it back into a tube like this, and being able to refill it with more paint. I feel like there could be a mechanism to maybe open this up, pinch off that seal, and then again refill it with new paint. I think recycling the tube might be a better choice than completely changing the tube's material. Again, we want something that preserves our paint and not destroys it before it even gets into our studio. But maybe I'm getting a little too ahead of myself here. I do think there's a question to be asked though. I'm speculating on a lot of this, and I do think it's important to ask ourselves as artists and consumers to think, what are we doing with our paint tubes? Are we just tossing them in the trash? Is there a better way? I'm not sure. But I will pose that question to you guys. I want you guys to think about, is there a way to maybe, is plastic better? Is metal better? Is it better to get a jar? I'm not really sure. But I think the question, posing the question to you, will at least build the conversation, maybe get us to ask questions as artists that maybe we haven't asked before. But I'm also curious on what you guys use. Do you have a preference versus the metal and plastic thing? I mean, most of my paint tubes are metal just because I go with certain brands. But I'm like, oh yeah, this is a plastic tube, this is a metal tube, it's going to behave a little bit differently. Do you have a preference? Or don't you care? Regardless of your situation though, let me know your thoughts in comments below. I've kind of got into this weird environmental tangent tonight that I was not even expecting to go on, but I think again, they're important questions to ask as artists. But if you enjoyed this, learned something, or just want to support the channel, go ahead and hit that like button. Get subscribed if you're not already. Check me out on social links in the description box below, including the community Discord. Keep on creating, and this has been from Cineblock Studios, and I will see you guys next time. Oh, shit. I'm surprised I was able to do that. I've been saucing it for like 3 hours.